I just created a sorcerer in Diablo 4 for the first time, and let me tell you, it is so good. So good. The sorcerer is so powerful and demolishes everybody in this game, and this is one of the characters you can actually power level to level 50 very fast. I've single-handedly gotten my sorcerer to level 38 in just about 6 hours. The sorcerer is so good you'll find yourself at level 50 in no time, because this sorcerer build absolutely smacks. This build is incredibly fun to play, even kind of tanky, and does so much damage and does an insane amount of damage, and I'm going to go through every single thing about this build so you can build it too. First, we're going to jump into the skill tree, so we're going to go over every single skill you need to know. So the first basic skill we need to know is Arc Lash. Arc Lash is our primary damage skill right off the bat. You're going to use this as your basic attack for a while. Nothing special about it specifically right off the bat, but then you're going to go into Enhanced Arc Lash, meaning if Arc Lash's initial swipe critically strikes an enemy, it swipes an additional time, giving you a free additional attack. This is going to be a good first starter skill. From there, you're going to want to go down to core skills and get into the meat and potatoes of this build, being Ice Shards. So Ice Shards is the primary ability that you're going to be dealing damage to every enemy with and be just running through enemies. And I kid you not, it's so good. So Ice Shards essentially shoots out 5 shards that do a range of damage, dealing 25% increased damage to frozen enemies. Now the way we structure this build is we're going to try and make enemies frozen as much as possible, so that we can take advantage of that extra damage. And eventually you can get it to where Ice Shards shoots indefinitely almost, so you can deal a ton of damage and use this skill over and over. We're going to spec into Enhanced Ice Shards, meaning they have a 40% chance to ricochet to another enemy, which is huge because they will bounce between almost every single enemy and deal a ton of damage to all enemies around, especially when frozen. So this is very good. And then you're going to go into Greater Ice Shards, meaning while you have a barrier active, casts of Ice Shards actually treat enemies as if they were frozen, even if they're not. So if you have a barrier up, which we're going to try and keep one up fairly decently in this build, it's going to treat enemies as they're frozen and again deal that extra 25% damage increase to them. Another skill you want to get a little bit later once you unlock your enchantments, but you don't need it directly right now, is Fireball. So Fireball is an extremely important skill because it gives our enchantment effect down at the bottom of the skill, which you can see, which means when you kill an enemy, they explode in a fireball for 50% of its damage. Now this is huge because when you actually kill an enemy, they're going to explode, dealing a bunch of damage around them. If any other enemies explode, they all blow up and deal damage, and then etc. So you can get a massive fireball chain just from killing one enemy, and they can all kind of explode and die all at once. And then we're just going to go into Enhanced Fireball, so that way the radius is increased based on the distance traveled up to 50%, so we get a bigger radius for our fireball enchantment this way. Next, we're going to jump down to our defensive skills, which we have a ton of skills in because this is our primary, or one of our primary categories. So first off, we're going to put points in Teleport. This is going to be one of your primary abilities because it's going to give you the ability to kind of kite around and get out of trouble when you need to, so you can get away from enemies and survive. It actually does deal damage, but this is going to be one of our primary escape abilities. And then you can go into Enhanced Teleport, where your teleport's cooldown is decreased by 5 seconds per enemy that you hit, up to 3 seconds. So you do get a little bit of a cooldown from this ability, so you can use it a little more often when needed. Next, we're going to go into Ice Armor, meaning a barrier of ice forms around you for 6 seconds and it absorbs 30% of your base life, meaning you get that extra barrier for protection so you can survive a little bit longer. And while this is active, you get 5% of your damage dealt added to the barrier, so you can deal a bunch of damage while you're using Ice Armor. It will build up your barrier very high, and it'll allow you to survive that much longer because you're going to have a large barrier of health there. We're then going to go into Enhanced Ice Armor, meaning while Ice Armor is active, you get mana regeneration increased by 25%, which is very good because this whole build is revolving around resource regeneration and regenerating your mana, so that way you can cast Ice Shards repetitively over and over again. Definitely need this skill. And then we're going to get into Frost Nova. So Frost Nova, you definitely want to put 5 out of 5 points here because this is a super important ability for this build. What Frost Nova does is it unleashes a frost that freezes enemies around you for 3 seconds. If you kill enemies that are frozen by Frost Nova, it reduces its cooldown by 1 second, up to 4 seconds per cast. And Frost Nova makes enemies vulnerable for 4 seconds, increased to 6 seconds against bosses. So Frost Nova is going to be something we cast on enemies to freeze them and deal a ton more damage to them because they're A, vulnerable, they're B, frozen, so we do a lot more damage to them, and C, they can't attack us, and our Ice Shards are going to bounce around all of these enemies, doing extra damage on all of them. You can wipe out an entire group of enemies in like 1 second. It's so good. And then we're going to jump down to Enhanced Frost Nova, giving us that cooldown reduction by 1 second, up to 4 seconds per cast, and Mystical Frost Nova, which again makes the enemies vulnerable. But Enhanced Frost Nova is super important because you can basically run down this entire cooldown for the skill. Another skill you're going to want to use at level 35 specifically, and I'll show you the leveling stuff specifically here in a minute, but eventually around level 35, you're going to want to go in here and drop this Enhanced Arc Lash, and you're going to want to pick up Flame Shield. So Flame Shield engulfs you in flames for 2 seconds, and it burns surrounding enemies around you. This also makes you immune, meaning characters cannot be damaged, and all of the effects on you that are control impairing are removed and prevented. So it will wipe all those effects away. And then we're going to go into Enhanced Flame Shield, meaning it grants you 25% movement speed while active, which is good for movability and survivability. Additionally, the 2 passives you're going to want here is Elemental Attunement. You're going to want 1 out of 3 here, so that way you get this bonus of critical strikes that have up to a 5% chance to reset the cooldown of one of your defensive skills. It can happen only once every 10 seconds, but it still gives you a very decent percentage chance of resetting one of your abilities automatically. And then finally, you want 3 out of 3 in Glass Cannon. That means you deal 18% increased damage, but take 9% more damage. So you deal out 2x extra damage more than you take. Totally worth the skill. You want 3 points here. The next skill you want to grab, which is your Conjuration skill, is Hydra. So Hydra is going to be a single target damage ability that you can summon for a very cheap amount of mana to help you fight a lot of enemies and deal a decent amount of damage. So it summons that 3-headed Hydra for 10 seconds, and each head deals a decent amount of damage to enemies. And then you're going to want to go into Enhanced Hydra, meaning while healthy, your casts of Hydra get an additional head. So if you have more than 80% of your life, it has an extra head on it, dealing extra damage. And then Invoked Hydra, meaning after you do a critical strike, your Hydras gain 30% critical strike chance for 3 seconds. If you deal a critical strike, which will be pretty consistently dealt, your Hydras are going to get that huge boost to critical strike chance almost indefinitely. So this is a must-have as well. The next skill you're going to want is Precision Magic, 3 out of 3, because you get lucky hit chance increased by 15%, which is a big bonus to get our lucky hit. Then you're going to want to have 1 out of 3 for Align the Elements, where you gain 1% damage reduction. This isn't necessarily important. We're trying to get to both these skills though, which are 2 out of 3 for Mana Shield, meaning every time you spend 100 mana, you gain 10% damage reduction for 5 seconds and gives us a decent amount of extra survivability. And then finally, we want 3 out of 3 on Protection, meaning using a cooldown grants 30% of your maximum life as a barrier for 2 seconds. So again, we put up a barrier with this skill as well, also with our other skill. And again, this is because our greater Ice Shards, meaning while we have a barrier active, all of our Ice Shard casts count as frozen on enemies. So that's super important because we deal a ton of extra damage when that's the case. We're then going to go down to our Mastery skills, where Icy Veil is going to be a 3 out of 3, and this is because your barriers have a 15% increased duration, again because we're trying to keep that barrier up to get our bonuses on frozen enemies, even if they're not frozen. So we're then going to go down to our ultimate skills, where we just want 3 passives specifically, being Permafrost, or where our frost skills deal 15% increased damage to elite enemies, helping with our single target damage. Icy Touch, where we deal 12% increased cold damage to vulnerable enemies. Again, we're going to try and make enemies as vulnerable as possible because they take extra damage when they're vulnerable anyways, just stacking our damage and DPS. And then Frigid Breeze, where cold damage against vulnerable enemies has up to a 20% chance to generate 15 mana, helping for our mana regeneration very, very much. And then finally, we're going to go down to our key passive, which is Avalanche. This key passive makes it so your frost skills get a 10% chance to make your next cast of Ice Shards, in this case, consume no mana and deal 40% increased damage. And the chance of that is actually doubled against vulnerable enemies. So we want to try and apply that vulnerable effect to enemies. Then we'll get a 20% chance of the next cast being free. We do a ton of additional damage with this key passive, so this is the one that you want. Now I'm going to show you the skill tree very quickly so that way you can take a glance at it in case you want to pause it and look at it. I'm also going to throw up the individual leveling guide right after this so that way you can see each level you should upgrade a skill at. And keep in mind, I am just below level 50, so some of these skills are going to be missing or aren't exactly how I've explained them. But if you have any questions, look at the written guide in the description and see the max levels for each skill, or just look at the leveling guide I'm going to throw up on the screen right now. And this shows every single level from level 1 to 50 on what you should put your skills in. And if you follow this, you should get a pretty consistent path all the way to level 50 and get all these skills leveled up completely fine. Next, we're going to look at the special ability for the sorcerer, which is going to be enchantments. The way enchantments work is you can put enchantments for skills that you have already got in your skill menu and put them here to get certain bonuses. For instance, in this case, if you followed the skill guide, you're going to use the Fireball enchantment, which again gives us that extra 50% damage for when you kill an enemy, they explode into a fireball and deal damage to enemies around them. And again, this is important because it can chain off of one enemy explode another enemy, and then they're all exploding, all dealing massive damage to each other. This skill is an absolute must-have. And then additionally, we're going to use Ice Shards Enchantment. This makes it so that Ice Shards automatically conjure and fly towards frozen enemies. And this also makes it so that Ice Shards have a 40% chance to ricochet to another enemy, but Ice Shards always ricochet off of frozen enemies. Meaning if we freeze enemies and we start shooting these, no matter where we're shooting them, they're going to do massive damage to everybody, and then they're going to explode, dealing extra massive damage to everybody. These combined makes wiping out groups almost instant in every single circumstance. But that is about as much as you need to know for both of these enchantments. Now additionally, once you get higher leveled, you do want to make sure that you swap out Arc Lash for Flame Shield, but it just depends what you're comfortable for right now. Eventually, you do want to swap it out though. Next, we're going to go over aspects for this build, and there are only 3 main ones I'm going to go over. Keep it short and simple, because these 3 aspects alone, if you just put it on your amulets and your rings, you can keep them on there for your entire build, and it will allow you to deal a ton of extra damage, so you definitely need these. The first one is going to be Prodigy's Aspect. This means using a cooldown restores 15 mana, and if we look at our Prodigy's band here, by using the Codex of Power to imprint this, we can make it sure using a cooldown does restore 15 mana, which is just what we want for this build, because it is going to allow us to regenerate our mana much quicker. It's going to allow us to keep more mana and spam Ice Shards much faster. Prodigy's Resource Aspect, if you look on the map right here, can be discovered at Witchwater Dungeon right here and Howitzer. This Witchwater Dungeon can be discovered right here on the map. And this is an alt character, so I don't have a lot of these areas discovered, but this is where you're going to find it. The next aspect we want is Aspect of Piercing Cold. This makes it so that Ice Shards pierce 3 times, dealing 25% less damage per subsequent enemy hit, which is huge because we get a ton of different extra hits on enemies by it piercing 3 individual times. And you can see my gear here, where we got a roll just doing the Codex of Power again, which allows that. And again, this can be put on a ring, so you want to put this on a ring and you want to put the previous aspect on a ring as well. It allows you to keep them and use them through level 1 through 50 and not really having to worry about replacing them constantly. And this aspect is going to be located right here at Dead Man's Dredge. So if you look right below Kiovashad, right here towards the edge of the map. And finally, the last aspect we want for this build is Aspect of Control. This makes it so you deal 25% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies, which again relies on the entire build itself because we're trying to make enemies frozen non-stop. So we're going to get that extra 25% more damage bonus because they're frozen or stunned. And this dungeon can be found on the very bottom left of the map. If you see the city down here, if you go to the waypoint right here, Iron Wolves Encampment, this dungeon Sunken Library is the one you get that at, and it is right here, right above this waypoint. So go there and you will unlock that Codex of Power. Again, imprint this on your rings and your amulet and you will be perfectly fine. You won't ever have to worry about really replacing them. Make sure you're using those 3 aspects described, and then you can use any other additional aspects you want while you have them. Anything regarding setting up a barrier or dealing extra damage is perfectly fine, but make sure you have those 3 and you will be set all the way to level 50 with no problems. Next, I'm going to throw up really quickly the stats on the screen for specifically what we want regarding certain stats for certain pieces of gear. A lot of things that we want are cooldown reduction, movement speed, and mana cost reduction. Again, cooldown reduction because we're going to get better cooldowns on our skills, allowing us to cast and spam skills faster. Mana cost reduction so we can constantly cast Ice Shards over and over and over again, and vulnerable damage to enemies because we're going to be dealing vulnerable damage to them a lot, as well as things like on this ring, 4% damage to frozen enemies, and 5% damage to chilled enemies. And finally, we're going to talk about the rotation, so I'll throw up some gameplay. So the way this rotation works is you're going to group up a bunch of enemies together. Once you get a big group of enemies together, you're going to walk as close to them as possible. Once you get close to them, you can then cast Frost Nova. As you cast Frost Nova, you're going to cast it, and they're going to be vulnerable and frozen, so you're going to be able to deal a massive amount of damage to these enemies. If you want, you can put down a Hydra first, so that way you can get the extra damage from that. So I'd actually recommend doing that in most cases. So in that case, you could throw down a Hydra, then cast Frost Nova when around enemies to freeze them all, and then you can spam Ice Shards until you can't anymore, and it'll bounce between enemies, dealing a ton of additional damage. And again, our enchantments will take care of finishing them off and blowing up all the enemies. So we're going to be able to wipe out groups in literally like 1 to 2 seconds. It's super good no matter where you're at in the game. We're also going to use our Flame Shield, our Teleport skill, and Ice Armor to stay alive because these are our defensive skills. So it's important to make sure you use these. The Teleport to get away because you can teleport pretty far away from enemies to kind of get out of the line of fire, especially if you get stuck around a group of enemies. Flame Shield for the extra defense, and Ice Armor for the extra defense as well. And specifically Ice Armor you can use, and once you use Ice Armor and we get that barrier around us for protection, you can then also continue to spam Ice Shards. Our Ice Shard skill also makes it so that way while we have a barrier activated through that skill, that means casts of Ice Shards treat all enemies as if they were frozen, dealing extra damage and giving us again all those extra benefits. So try and use Ice Armor when enemies are not frozen, so that way you can demolish them when they're frozen, and then cast Ice Armor for protection and demolish them again while they're not frozen. And you can rinse and repeat these skills, but primarily the gear again and the aspects we want to use should be focused as much as possible around mana regeneration and regenerating our mana in a way so that way, so hopefully at some point we can cast Ice Shards infinitely. Once you get to the point you have enough mana regeneration and stuff like that, you can cast Ice Shards over and over and over. So that is the Ice Shards Sorcerer build that is extremely powerful, and not only powerful, guys, it is very fun to play. I have played it a ton, and it is like so enjoyable to just run solo, run with the group. It's very fun. Definitely recommend you give it a try if you don't have a sorcerer already. That being said, let me know what you guys think in the comments, like the video if you haven't already, and check out one of these Diablo videos on the left or right of the screen, and I'll see you guys in another video. Peace.